August 1945. A village outside Yokohama. The air was still thick with the smell of ash and damp earth. Charred rooftops leaned like broken ribs against a pale sky. Children with hollow eyes crouched beside the remains of a rice field, too weak to cry. For weeks, rumors had spread through the countryside. The Americans are coming. Some said they would burn what was left. Others whispered they would take the women, the food, the last breath of Japan. So when the first trucks rumbled down the dirt road, villagers hid behind the shattered walls of their homes. But the soldiers who stepped out carried no rifles. They carried boxes marked with strange English letters and a red cross. Inside was milk powder, penicillin, soap. A Japanese mother stared as an American medic knelt to clean her child's infected wound. No words were exchanged, only disbelief. The enemy had arrived, and they were saving lives. From that day, everything the villagers thought they knew about the war and the Americans began to unravel. By the final months of 1945, Japan was a dying empire wrapped in silence. What had once been a proud island nation of artisans, farmers, and soldiers was now a graveyard of ashes and hunger. The land was broken. The sky carried the acrid scent of burned wood and metal, and the rivers ran dark with debris from bombed-out cities. From Hokkaido to Kyushu, the war had left no untouched corner. The nightly drone of American B-29 bombers had become as familiar as the wind. Each raid erased another piece of a city. Schools, hospitals, homes, entire neighborhoods vanished under waves of napalm. In Tokyo, the March 1945 firebombing alone had killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night, more than the atomic bombs would claim in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Wooden houses burned like dry leaves. The morning after, nothing remained but scorched earth and twisted metal. The survivors, mostly women, children, and the elderly, wandered through what was once their city, clutching the ashes of family heirlooms. By August, Japan's industrial base had ceased to function. Coal production was down by 70%. Rail networks lay in ruins. Food supply had collapsed. Even in the countryside, where people once believed they would find refuge, life had become a slow death. The rice fields had not yielded enough to feed the villages. Fertilizers were gone. Tools were broken. Young men, the farmers, the fathers, the sons, had died in faraway jungles and seas. The home islands, once isolated by pride and propaganda, now faced a reality their leaders had hidden. Defeat, total and irreversible. The voice of the Emperor on August 15, 1945. Millions of Japanese huddled around their radios. Static crackled. Then came a trembling, distant voice. The Emperor himself. For most, it was the first time they had ever heard him speak. He did not say the word surrender, but everyone understood. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan had failed. Men broke down weeping in the streets. Women fell to their knees. Children looked on, confused, as their parents, the generation that had promised them eternal victory, now bowed their heads in shame. For decades, the Japanese had been told they were chosen, their emperor a living god, their cause righteous. To lose was unthinkable. To surrender was impossible. And yet, it had happened. The war that began in triumph and confidence had ended in silence. The soldiers were coming home. Those who were still alive. They returned thin as shadows, in tattered uniforms, carrying haunted eyes. They brought no glory, only stories of loss, starving comrades on Pacific islands, suicide missions against American warships, the burning skies of Okinawa. Behind them came the refugees. Millions of civilians fleeing bombed-out cities poured into rural Japan, seeking food and safety. Trains were overcrowded with the sick and the desperate. Many never made it home. The hunger, The war had left Japan's economy in ruins. By the time of surrender, agricultural production had dropped to 53% of 1934 levels. Fertilizers and machinery were gone. Imports from Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria had ceased. Food rationing collapsed, and black markets flourished. A loaf of bread or a handful of rice could cost an entire week's wages. In Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, thousands died not from bombs, but from hunger. Starving mothers boiled tree bark to feed their children. Children wandered alone through train stations, scavenging for scraps, their stomachs swollen with malnutrition. In the countryside, farmers hoarded what little rice they had, knowing that government rations could no longer reach them. The once proud and disciplined society now struggled simply to survive another day. And yet, even in starvation, fear of the enemy lingered. For years, state propaganda had depicted Americans as monsters, brutal invaders who tortured prisoners, raped women, and destroyed temples. Posters and school lessons warned that capture by Americans was worse than death. Mothers told their children, "If they come, take this knife. Do not let them take you alive." In Okinawa, civilians had already proven the power of that fear. Thousands had leapt from cliffs or detonated grenades rather than surrender to U.S. forces. So when word spread that the American occupation was coming, terror spread faster than hunger. Rumors filled the streets. They will burn what's left. They will enslave us. They will take revenge. The silence. Before the arrival, in late August 1945, the sound of bombers was replaced by another sound, the steady hum of American transport planes descending over Japan. On August 30th, at Atsugi Airfield outside Tokyo, the first American aircraft touched down. From its cabin stepped General Douglas MacArthur, pipe in hand, calm and expressionless. Photographers captured the moment. The conqueror of the Pacific walking down the runway, Japan's fate now resting in his hands. Behind him came tens of thousands of troops from the U.S. 8th Army and the British Commonwealth Forces. They were part of Operation Blacklist, the code name for the Allied occupation of Japan. The villagers. Watch the convoys roll through the roads. Olive green trucks filled with soldiers wearing crisp uniforms and strange smiles. For the first time, many Japanese saw the enemy up close. They expected rage, cruelty, arrogance. But what they saw instead was something else entirely. The soldiers were calm. They waved at children. They handed out candy and chewing gum. Some even bowed politely. A gesture that stunned onlookers who had been told the enemy was incapable of respect. At first, no one dared approach them. Women kept their distance, clutching their children. Old men glared silently as the trucks passed, but the Americans did not take. They gave. They unloaded wooden crates stamped with foreign markings and a red cross. Inside, tinned meat, powdered milk, wheat flour, and, most precious of all, medicine. Hunger was only part of the crisis. By late 1945, Japan faced epidemics that threatened to kill more than the bombs ever had. Tuberculosis spread through overcrowded shelters. Typhus, dysentery, and malaria ravaged the weakened population. Hospitals were either destroyed or without supplies. There were no antibiotics, no anesthetics, no disinfectants. Doctors reused old bandages, boiled in water again and again. Children died of infections from simple cuts. Japan's once disciplined medical system had collapsed under the weight of total war. And then, unexpectedly, help began to arrive. The U.S. occupation forces brought something few Japanese had ever seen: penicillin. It had been developed and mass-produced during the war, saving countless Allied soldiers. Now, it would save the lives of those who had once been the enemy. To the villagers who watched American medics treat their sick children, the moment was almost surreal. The same nation that had burned their cities was now trying to keep them alive. The first glimpse of change as autumn turned to winter in 1945. The first relief shipments reached the countryside. Trucks carried sacks of American wheat and rice. Field kitchens distributed hot soup and canned rations. U.S. Army doctors set up mobile clinics in temples, schools, and public halls. For many villagers, it was their first warm meal in months. For others, it was the first time they had ever seen a foreigner. At night, the villagers whispered in disbelief. The Americans smiled at us. They treated our sick. They gave us food. Some still suspected a trap. Others, too hungry to care, accepted the aid with trembling hands. Slowly, fear began to give way to curiosity. The occupation had begun not with vengeance, but with compassion, a quiet campaign to keep a defeated nation from dying. But Japan's crisis was far from over. Its cities lay in ruins, its economy in shambles, and its people teetering on the edge of famine. The true test for the Americans and for Japan's survival was yet to come. That test would arrive in the months ahead, when millions faced starvation and the U.S. government had to decide whether to feed the very nation it had fought to destroy. The war had ended, but for Japan, survival was only beginning. When American forces officially took control in September 1945, they found a country on the verge of social collapse. Rail lines were broken, harbors destroyed, power grids dark. Food distribution had ceased entirely in many areas. Japan's urban population was starving, and its rural communities were scarcely better off. Yet General Douglas MacArthur, arriving in Tokyo as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, ESCAP, did not rule through fear. He ruled through order, and through a quiet, calculated compassion. To the Japanese, he appeared almost otherworldly, tall, erect, with his signature sunglasses and pipe, walking calmly through crowds that bowed to him as they once bowed to the emperor. But behind that theatrical presence was a man with a mission unlike any in history: to remake an empire without destroying its soul. The occupation begins. General Headquarters, GHQ, was established in Tokyo's Daiichi Building, once a symbol of Japanese industrial might. From there, MacArthur and his multinational staff of American officers, economists, doctors, and educators began what would become one of the most ambitious social transformations in modern history. But before democracy, before reform, before disarmament, came food. The first reports reaching GHQ were horrifying. By October 1945, Japan's caloric intake had fallen below 1,500 calories per day, half of what was needed to sustain life. Urban workers fainted in factories. Children collapsed in schoolyards. Without immediate aid, millions could die before winter's end. MacArthur understood the stakes. In a memorandum to Washington, he wrote bluntly, "Starvation in Japan would mean riots, chaos, and the collapse of all authority." He needed food, fast. Operation of Relief in November 1945. The first emergency shipments began arriving. American cargo ships, redirected from Pacific bases, unloaded tons of flour, corn, and powdered milk at Yokohama and Kobe. These were not formal reparations or charity, they were relief supplies, authorized by SCAP under MacArthur's direct command. Distribution was an immense logistical challenge. Japan's infrastructure was shattered. Roads were broken, rail cars destroyed, bridges collapsed. In many regions, food could only reach villages by truck convoys driven by U.S. soldiers or Japanese volunteers under American supervision. Each sack of grain carried the label "Gift of the United States of America" for villagers who saw them for the first time. These bags became symbols of something almost mythical: sustenance from the hands of the enemy. To the Americans, it was a humanitarian necessity. To the Japanese, it was an emotional shock. Medicine for a sick nation, food could stave off hunger, but disease was killing faster. By the end of 1945, outbreaks of typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery had reached epidemic proportions. Japanese hospitals stood in ruins. There were no antibiotics, no soap, and few working doctors. So SCAP turned to one of America's newest wartime innovations, penicillin. During the war, the U.S. had perfected the mass production of this antibiotic. Now, for the first time in history, it was made available to civilians in an enemy nation. By early 1946, medical supply convoys moved across Japan. U.S. Army doctors trained Japanese physicians and nurses in the use of penicillin and modern sterilization techniques. Mobile hospitals, small tents or schoolhouses turned into clinics, appeared in villages, staffed by Japanese medics using American equipment. Children suffering from infections, once left to die, began to recover within days. Mothers wept in disbelief as the enemy medicine worked miracles unseen in all of Japanese history. The Japanese called it the magic drug. In truth, it was more than medicine. It was symbolism. For the first time, the U.S. was healing a nation it had once destroyed. MacArthur's rule of reform, while relief operations expanded, MacArthur turned to a deeper challenge, reshaping Japan's political and social foundations. The occupation government issued sweeping reforms. Dissolution of the Japanese Army and Navy, release of political prisoners, establishment of civil rights and freedom of speech, reconstruction of Japan's education system, but to the villagers, politics meant little. What they noticed were the tangible changes: American trucks arriving with food, U.S. soldiers building bridges, engineers repairing water pumps, doctors visiting schools. MacArthur insisted that American soldiers maintain strict discipline. Looting, abuse, or misconduct were punished harshly. The result was something the Japanese had not expected: respect. Even in rural areas where suspicion lingered, villagers began to greet passing patrols with cautious bows. Children approached them shyly for candy. And in time, conversations began. Broken English, broken Japanese, and the universal language of humanity. The psychological transformation for months. The Japanese people had lived in terror of the Americans. But as winter of 1945 turned into the spring of 1946, the image began to shift. The devils described in wartime posters were now feeding the poor. The barbarians of propaganda were handing out powdered milk to malnourished children. The transformation was not instant nor universal. Many Japanese still resented the occupation deeply, especially those who had lost loved ones to the bombings. But for ordinary villagers, farmers, mothers, children, survival mattered more than pride. And so, each day, the small gestures of the occupation, a medic dressing a wound, a soldier sharing his rations, a doctor teaching sanitation, began to undo years of propaganda and fear. In diaries kept by Japanese civilians during these months, one theme recurs: disbelief. They smile, one woman wrote in a village near Chiba. They speak gently to our children. They treat our sick. These cannot be the same people who burned our cities. Feeding the nation, by mid-1946, the United States had delivered over 800,000 tons of food to Japan. The cargo included wheat, corn, milk, lard, and soybeans, ingredients that would forever change Japan's diet. Schools began serving American lunches: bread, milk, and stew made from donated ingredients. To children who had known only starvation, these meals were life itself. Meanwhile, American experts worked alongside Japanese officials to restore domestic agriculture. The land reform program redistributed millions of acres from absentee landlords to tenant farmers, increasing production and stabilizing rural life. Villages that had once feared occupation troops were now hosting agricultural advisors from the U.S., learning techniques to improve yield and irrigation. The results came slowly. But by 1947, Japan's harvests began to recover. The unspoken motive. There was another layer to America's generosity, one rooted not in sentiment, but in strategy. Washington understood that a starving Japan could become fertile ground for social unrest, and, potentially, for communist influence from the Soviet Union. Feeding Japan was not just moral, it was geopolitical. A healthy, democratic Japan would serve as a stable ally in Asia. But for the villagers who received those first loaves of bread, geopolitics didn't matter. What mattered was that their children were alive. A nation begins to breathe. Again, by 1947, the signs of recovery were visible even in the most remote provinces. Markets reopened. Factories began to hum faintly again. Schools filled with children instead of hunger. Where American trucks once rolled through villages with relief supplies, new Japanese cooperatives began distributing homegrown food. Penicillin had nearly eradicated the worst epidemics. Infant mortality dropped sharply, and in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, gratitude began to replace fear. Posters of hatred were replaced with leaflets of cooperation. Radio broadcasts once filled with war slogans now spoke of peace, education, and rebuilding. Villagers still bowed to American soldiers, but now it was not from fear. It was from respect. For many, the moment that defined the change came not in grand speeches or official ceremonies, but in small, personal acts of kindness. An American medic kneeling beside a Japanese child, a soldier helping rebuild a bridge, a nurse teaching a village woman how to purify water. The seeds of trust had been planted, not through politics, but through compassion. Yet, as Japan entered 1946, a new and far greater challenge loomed. A massive crop failure and global food shortages threatened to undo everything the occupation had achieved. The nation stood once more on the brink of famine. And once again, the eyes of Japan turned toward the Americans, this time not with fear, but with hope. In every Japanese village, the story began the same way, with fear. The sight of American trucks approaching down a dusty road was enough to send children running into the hills. Mothers grabbed their infants and hid behind temple walls. Old men clutched their bamboo spears, useless against tanks, but symbols of the last shred of pride. No one believed the Americans could be merciful. They had been taught that mercy did not exist in the hearts of foreigners. And yet, as weeks passed, fear began to erode under the weight of reality. First contact in a village near Shizuoka. An old woman remembered the first day American medics arrived. They came in jeeps, stopping near the schoolhouse that had become a shelter for bombed-out families. One soldier climbed out, his uniform dusty, his hands clean. He carried a wooden crate marked with a red cross. No one moved. Then, slowly, he opened the lid and began handing out small tins, condensed milk and biscuits. The villagers watched in silence. When one child reached forward timidly, the soldier smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. It was a small gesture. But in that instant, something inside the villagers shifted. For years, their government had painted Americans as demons, but demons did not bring milk to starving children. The unspoken language. In the following months, scenes like this played out across Japan. U.S. military trucks arrived with supplies. Japanese interpreters, often young women who had studied English before the war, translated instructions for villagers. There was little conversation. Words failed on both sides, but gestures replaced language. A nod, a smile, a soldier bending to pour soup into a wooden bowl, a Japanese mother bowing in gratitude, tears welling in her eyes. For many Americans, the experience was equally strange. They had fought brutal campaigns against Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender, who died rather than yield. Now they were tending to their children. Many wrote home, astonished at what they saw. Private letters preserved in U.S. archives describe Japanese villagers as polite, quiet, and grateful. One Marine sergeant wrote, "We were told they would hate us, but they bow and thank us. The little ones laugh when we hand them food. It feels unreal. These are the people we fought." It was a sentiment shared by many occupation soldiers, a realization that the enemy was human. Propaganda versus reality. The contrast between wartime propaganda and daily reality was staggering. Japanese civilians had spent years under total state control. The wartime Ministry of Information dictated every newspaper article, radio broadcast, and classroom lesson. The enemy was described as a beast, a white barbarian with no honor or soul. Children were shown drawings of Americans drinking blood, destroying temples, murdering civilians. Teachers warned, "They will come for your daughters. They will defile the emperor's land." And then, suddenly, these monsters arrived, smiling, quiet, and kind. They brought candy instead of chains. One Japanese schoolteacher later recalled the day an American medic treated her students' skin infections with ointment and gauze. "We were told they would tear down our schools. Instead, they helped rebuild them." It was not just physical reconstruction, it was psychological. The Americans were not erasing Japan's spirit. They were saving its body. The faces of help among the most beloved figures of the early occupation were the army nurses and medics. Many were women barely in their 20s, stationed in rural areas to teach hygiene, child nutrition, and basic first aid. They wore crisp white uniforms, their faces unfamiliar yet gentle. In villages where mothers had lost everything, homes, husbands, sons, the sight of a woman in white offering medicine was both comforting and confusing. In some towns, villagers referred to them as white angels. The nickname spread quietly, first whispered, then spoken with respect. One Japanese nurse trainee from Kyoto later wrote in her diary, "When the American nurse took my hand, I felt ashamed. We had hated them, and yet she smiled. She said, 'Let's save your people together.' I cried." That small moment of shared purpose, the enemy teaching the defeated, captured the essence of what was happening in Japan. The first winter. The winter of 1945-46 was the harshest in memory. Snow covered the burnt ruins of Tokyo and the barren fields of rural Japan. Families huddled around makeshift stoves, burning furniture to stay warm. In many villages, the only warmth came from American field kitchens. Soldiers set up large cauldrons of soup, a mix of American canned goods and local vegetables. The smell drew people from miles away. At first, they watched from afar, afraid to approach. But hunger was stronger than fear. Soon, long lines formed. A U.S. Army report from Niigata noted that in a single day, over 3,000 villagers were fed by one field kitchen. Children brought small bowls or tin cups. Mothers bowed deeply before accepting their rations. And at night, around those steaming pots, the silence of occupation began to thaw. Human curiosity. The Americans, too, were curious. They walked through villages, sketching temples, studying customs, learning words. They found the Japanese polite to a fault, orderly even in ruin. When asked by reporters what surprised him most, one U.S. Army officer replied, "How little hatred there is. These people have nothing, but they still bow and thank us." The Japanese press, under SCAP supervision, began publishing stories of friendship between villagers and occupation troops. Photographs appeared of American soldiers planting rice, teaching baseball, and distributing milk. These were more than propaganda. They were glimpses of truth. For the first time in centuries, Japan was opening itself to the world, not through conquest, but through compassion. A nation relearning humanity in the villages. Something quiet but profound was happening. For the first time, many Japanese began to see their own humanity reflected through the kindness of others. And the Americans, who came expecting hostility, found gratitude instead. These human encounters, humble, unplanned, unrecorded in official histories, were the heart of Japan's post-war transformation. Every bowl of soup shared, every wound cleaned, every child lifted onto a truck for medical care became a small act of repair, not only to the body, but to the soul of a nation. The occupation had begun as an act of surrender, but by the spring of 1946, it had turned into something else, a fragile, growing partnership between conqueror and conquered. But compassion alone could not save Japan. That year, as the crops failed and food reserves ran out, the young peace faced its greatest test yet. Millions stood once more on the edge of starvation, and the question arose: would the Americans continue to feed the people they had once bombed? When American aid first reached Japan, it was not charity, it was logistics. Behind every smiling medic in a village stood a vast coordinated network of ships, railroads, warehouses, and policy papers. The operation that fed Japan was one of the largest humanitarian mobilizations in human history, planned by the same military that had planned its destruction. The machinery of relief, the TE. Transformation began in September 1945 when the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, established his headquarters in Tokyo. His mission was clear: prevent famine, disease, and chaos that could push Japan into rebellion or communism. The task was monumental. Japan's rail system was shattered. Ports were clogged with wreckage. Warehouses burned, power grids crippled, millions homeless. MacArthur's staff, working under SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, realized that without immediate food imports, up to 10 million Japanese could die within months. So, even before the war crimes trials began, ships began to arrive. Not with bombs, but with wheat, corn, powdered milk, and medicine. These supplies came through U.S. Army logistics channels, the same supply networks that had once fueled island invasions. Now, they were repurposed for mercy. By early 1946, more than 500,000 tons of American grain were being unloaded each month at Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagasaki. The flow of aid kept millions alive. Operation White Cross, among the earliest organized relief efforts, was Operation White Cross, led by U.S. military medical units working alongside the Japanese Ministry of Health. In rural prefectures, mobile medical teams were dispatched to combat epidemics of tuberculosis, dysentery, and malnutrition. These units carried penicillin, DDT for sanitation, and infant formula, all technologies unknown to most Japanese at the time. U.S. Army doctors set up mobile clinics in schools, temples, and railway stations. They trained young Japanese doctors and nurses in Western medical techniques, from sterilization to vaccination. Between 1946 and 1948, over 20 million Japanese citizens received medical aid or vaccination under U.S.-led programs. 2. Report from the 8th Army Medical Corps noted that death rates from communicable diseases fell by over 60% within 2 years. Medicine had become the new diplomacy. The science of survival to prevent famine, the Americans turned to agricultural science. U.S. experts from the Department of Agriculture and the Army Quartermaster Corps introduced modern fertilizers, mechanized farming, and new strains of wheat and rice. The Japanese countryside, once worked by hand with wooden plows, began to see tractors for the first time. American agronomists taught soil management, crop rotation, and pest control, innovations that would later fuel Japan's Green Revolution. In Hokkaido and northern Honshu, large cooperative farms were reorganized under new land reform policies. These reforms broke the centuries-old landlord system, giving land to those who actually tilled it. By 1948, Japanese grain production had nearly returned to pre-war levels, a recovery so fast that the United Nations cited it as unprecedented in post-war history. This agricultural transformation wasn't just about feeding bellies. It restored dignity to people who had spent years bowing to starvation. Feeding the future. The school lunch revolution, one of the most lasting legacies of U.S. humanitarian policy, was something deceptively simple: school lunches. In 1946, SCAPE authorized the distribution of American surplus wheat, powdered milk, and canned goods to Japanese schools. It started as an emergency nutrition project, but soon became a nationwide system. By 1947, over 4 million children were receiving daily school meals supplied by the U.S. and coordinated by Japanese teachers. For many, it was the first time they had eaten bread, butter, or milk. The program did more than prevent starvation. It created lifelong memories. Japanese children associated these meals with care and normalcy, not defeat. Decades later, Japan's national school lunch program still bore traces of its origin, a living legacy of that post-war compassion. Rebuilding medicine, rebuilding trust in Tokyo, the U.S. Public Health and Welfare Section, the PHW, was created to restructure Japan's entire medical system. Hospitals were rebuilt, sanitation laws enforced, and modern health education introduced. The Americans encouraged Japanese doctors to study abroad and provided access to cutting-edge medical research. New public health campaigns tackled everything from dental hygiene to family planning, subjects once taboo in Japanese society. By 1950, Japan's life expectancy had risen by nearly 10 years compared to 1945. More importantly, medicine became the bridge that reconnected Japan to the modern world. A generation of Japanese medical professionals would later credit those post-war years with reshaping their philosophy of care, blending Western science with Japanese compassion. Logistics of compassion behind. These massive efforts stood a logistical miracle. The U.S. military created an intricate system of supply depots, fuel convoys, and distribution routes spanning thousands of kilometers. Every shipment of grain or medicine was tracked through the same precision systems once used for ammunition and rations. Rail lines were repaired, harbors dredged, and new warehouses built by joint U.S.-Japanese engineering teams. American GIs worked side by side with Japanese civilians to unload cargo, repair roads, and deliver food to the remotest prefectures. Each ton of wheat represented not just nourishment, but trust, a physical expression of peace in motion. A strategy. Hidden in humanity, while compassion was genuine, there was strategy beneath it. MacArthur and his advisors understood that feeding Japan was also political warfare. A starving, desperate population could easily fall to communist influence, especially as the Soviet Union expanded in Asia. Thus, humanitarian aid became a weapon of stability. Keeping Japan alive meant keeping it aligned with the West. But for the villagers receiving milk and medicine, politics didn't matter. What mattered was that the Americans, the very people they once feared, were the reason their children could wake up another day. Seeds of transformation. By 1949, the humanitarian phase had matured into a national reconstruction. Japan's factories hummed again. Its people were fed, its schools reopened, its hospitals modernized. The U.S. occupation had begun as an act of control. But through food, medicine, and education, it evolved into a partnership that redefined both nations. For the Japanese, it was a revelation. Defeat could be the beginning of rebirth. For the Americans, it was proof that victory meant more than destruction. It meant reconstruction. The same hands that had dropped bombs now planted seeds. And as the humanitarian mission continued, one moment would come to define everything. When compassion met desperation on a national scale. The winter famine of 1946-47. It was the moment Japan's survival truly hung in the balance. And when America made the decision that would change the future of Asia. Winter 1946. Snow fell in silence over a land stripped bare. In Tokyo, the streets were filled with thin faces and quiet hunger. People burned tatami mats and books to stay warm. Rice was gone. Potatoes, gone. Even grass and weeds became scarce. In the countryside, farmers hid what little food they had from government collectors. Children collapsed on their way to school, fainting from malnutrition. Reports from the Ministry of Health estimated that more than 12 million Japanese were suffering from chronic hunger. The war had ended, but death was still marching across Japan. Invisible, cold, unstoppable. A nation on the edge. General Douglas MacArthur, in his Tokyo headquarters, received the reports daily. His officers warned that unless food imports were drastically increased, mass starvation would break out by spring. Factories stood idle. Ports were frozen. Farm yields had collapsed after years of neglect and bombing. Even the black market, which had thrived amid chaos, began to dry up. There was nothing left to sell, and no one strong enough to steal. For the first time, some Japanese began to whisper that perhaps surrender had been a mistake. Defeat, they said, had brought peace, but not life. The American dilemma in Washington. President Harry Truman faced a difficult question. How much more aid could America send to its former enemy when Europe, too, was starving? The Marshall Plan was still in planning stages. The U.S. public was weary of war and tired of giving. Congress debated whether Japan deserved help at all, but MacArthur did not wait for permission. He sent a direct message to Washington. If we allow Japan to starve, we will lose the peace we have just won. The line carried both moral weight and strategic foresight. A dying Japan could turn to the Soviet Union for help, and that, MacArthur knew, would change the balance of Asia forever. Operation Famine Relief. By January 1947, an emergency plan was set in motion. American cargo ships, once used for Pacific combat, were reassigned to carry wheat and corn to Japan. Convoys departed from Seattle, San Francisco, and Manila, loaded with sacks of U.S. grain. In Japan, the Eighth Army organized a new supply network. Trains, trucks, and barges carrying food to every prefecture. When the first shipments arrived in Yokohama, villagers gathered along the docks. They watched as cranes lifted crates marked U.S. Army, food relief. For the first time in months, people cheered. Bread for Japan. The new food relief was unlike anything the Japanese had ever eaten. The Americans introduced bread and wheat-based foods, a complete shift from Japan's rice-centered diet. At first, many villagers were skeptical. They called it strange food, hard to swallow, foreign. But hunger overcame hesitation. Bakeries were reopened, and schools began distributing bread and milk to children. It was the beginning of a quiet cultural revolution. The birth of Japan's modern food habits. One Tokyo newspaper wrote in early 1947, "The eye eats taste of bread is the taste of peace." Scenes of desperation, even with massive shipments arriving. The scale of need was overwhelming. In the northern prefectures, trains bringing food were sometimes met by hundreds of starving civilians. Witnesses recalled desperate scenes, people climbing onto rail cars, begging soldiers for a handful of grain. American officers described villages where families survived on grass soup and bark tea. A U.S. Army photographer captured an image of a mother cradling her infant in the snow, waiting in line for food. The photo, later published in Life magazine, shocked the world. It reminded both victors and vanquished that peace could be just as cruel as war. The turn in the tide. By late spring 1947, the tide began to turn. Thanks to relentless American shipping and Japanese cooperation, millions of tons of food had reached the population. Disease rates began to fall. Children returned to school. Factories reopened as workers regained strength. The humanitarian mission, at first viewed as temporary, had become the backbone of Japan's recovery. In a speech to his staff that summer, MacArthur declared, "We have turned defeat into hope. The spirit of a nation is being reborn." A different kind of victory for the U.S. soldiers who distributed food in rural Japan. The moment was deeply personal. Many had fought in Okinawa or Iwo Jima, brutal campaigns where mercy was impossible. Now, they were handing food to the families of men they had once fought. Private diaries reveal how it changed them. One American wrote, "I saw a boy in rags smile when we gave him bread. I thought of my own son back home. Maybe this is what victory is supposed to look like." The line between enemy and friend blurred until it disappeared completely. By the end of 1947, famine had been averted. Japan had survived, barely. The trucks that once brought milk and medicine to villages now carried something else: tools, textbooks, seeds, and hope. But the story was not over yet. The next phase would define the future, when America began to rebuild not just Japan's body, but its soul. Spring 1947. Japan. For the first time in years, the cherry blossoms bloomed over a land that could finally look up at the sky without fear. They blossomed among ruins, around the skeletons of burned temples, on the cracked pavements of Tokyo, in schoolyards where children now played with sticks for baseball bats. The war was gone, but its echo was everywhere. In the empty rice bowls, in the faces of mothers still wearing the same faded kimonos from the day of surrender. And yet, there was motion again. Hunger had not vanished, but it had met resistance. From hands that worked, and from strangers who refused to let Japan die. The famine was fading, and with it, the hatred that once seemed eternal. The quiet resurrection across the islands, something extraordinary began to take shape. Quiet, unseen by the world's headlines. Where once the bombers had flown, now came ships filled with wheat. Where once soldiers had fought, now came teachers, engineers, and medics. Japan was rebuilding, not under orders, but through sheer will. In the rice paddies of Fukuoka, farmers worked the frozen earth with plows borrowed from American engineers. Children carried seedlings in baskets woven from scrap wire. Old men who had once bowed to generals now bowed to the soil. In Tokyo, trains ran again, some with their roofs still scorched, some running on makeshift wheels. At every station, volunteers unloaded sacks of U.S. grain, cans of powdered milk, and medical supplies. The Japanese government, newly restructured under MacArthur's guidance, coordinated local committees to distribute aid fairly. Even former officers, men who had fought to the death for the emperor, now helped load food onto carts for village families. Defeat had erased old ranks. Now everyone was simply Japanese, hungry, humbled, and rebuilding. The emperor's transformation in May 1947, a new constitution came into effect, one that renounced war forever. On the same day, Emperor Hirohito appeared on national radio, his voice calm, almost fragile. He thanked the Allied powers for their mercy. He spoke of a future built upon peace and cooperation. For a people who had worshipped him as divine, hearing the emperor speak in human tones was staggering. He no longer stood above them. He stood with them. Many wept in silence. For the first time, their emperor was not a god, but a man who shared their suffering and their gratitude. MacArthur listening from his Tokyo office, understood the magnitude of the moment. This was not just the transformation of a government. It was the rebirth of a civilization. The letters of gratitude. In the months that followed, the Americans began to receive letters, hundreds, then thousands, from ordinary Japanese citizens. Most were written in broken English, some dictated by children who could barely write their own names. They came from mountain villages, fishing towns, and bombed cities. A letter from Kyoto read, "Before you come, we believe America was our death. But now we see America is our life. We never forget this kindness." From Hiroshima, another, "I am survivor of atomic bomb. I hate no more. Because you give us medicine. Because you help our children live." MacArthur's staff pinned these letters on a wall in GHQ, a mosaic of handwriting from a nation once called enemy. Soldiers who passed by stopped to read them in silence. It was history, written not in treaties, but in human hearts. The village of reconciliation in one small fishing village near Nagasaki. American sailors and local fishermen formed an unlikely alliance. The Americans provided rope and nets. The Japanese taught them to catch squid and repair wooden boats. Every morning, they worked side by side. No words needed. The Americans called the village Little Peace Harbor. One sailor later told a journalist, "We bombed their sea 2 years ago. Now we fish it together. It's strange." And right. That simple partnership captured the essence of the new Japan. Not erased, not subjugated, but transformed through coexistence. The birth of the school lunch miracle in 1946, American wheat began to replace rice in school kitchens. By 1947, millions of children across Japan lined up each day for small portions of bread, powdered milk, and vegetable soup. To outsiders, it looked like a modest relief measure. To Japan, it was salvation. Teachers kept detailed records of their students' health. Within months, weight and height began to rise. Children who had been too weak to study now laughed and ran in the schoolyard. The bread, plain, white, soft, became a symbol of peace. Even decades later, elderly Japanese would recall the smell of those loaves, steaming from American-built ovens. It wasn't just food. It was proof that someone cared whether they lived or died. Healing through medicine in Tokyo's hospitals. American doctors trained young Japanese physicians in techniques that had once been exclusive to the West. Blood transfusions, sterile surgery, and the use of penicillin. At first, communication was clumsy. Doctors mimed procedures, drew sketches, and translated through hand gestures. But soon, collaboration became natural. One Japanese trainee, Dr. Arai, later wrote, "We learned from those who once destroyed our cities. They treated us as equals, not as the defeated. In their science, we found humanity." The partnership revolutionized Japanese health care. By 1950, death from infectious diseases had dropped dramatically. Public health, once a privilege, became a right. The American military, which had once been an engine of destruction, had become an engine of healing. Human connections in the countryside. Soldiers often returned from patrols with gifts from villagers, handmade fans, calligraphy scrolls, or origami cranes. Children began following American jeeps, shouting, "Give me chocolate!" a phrase that would echo through post-war Japan for years. But the exchange wasn't one-sided. Many soldiers brought home pieces of Japan with them, not as trophies, but as reminders of humanity rediscovered. One U.S. corporal, stationed near Kyoto, sent a letter home saying, "I came here expecting enemies. I found friends. Maybe this is how peace begins. One meal, one handshake at a time." Love amid the ashes as trust deepened. Something even more unexpected began to happen. Romances blossomed between American servicemen and Japanese women. At first, such relationships were frowned upon by both sides, but love, as it often does, ignored rules. By 1948, thousands of marriages had taken place under occupation supervision. Each one was a quiet act of defiance against the hatred that had fueled years of war. To many, these marriages symbolized something larger: the union of two cultures, born from tragedy but anchored in hope. The cultural exchange American GIs introduced Japan to jazz, Coca-Cola, and baseball. Japanese craftsmen repaired American instruments, tailored uniforms, and invited soldiers to local festivals. Slowly, cultures blended, not through dominance, but through curiosity. The Japanese adapted American influences with grace, turning them into something uniquely their own. Children learned English songs in schools. Young men watched American films at occupation theaters and dreamed of modernity. And Americans, too, found themselves changed, humbled by the resilience and dignity of the people they had once fought. The Inner Revolution, by late 1948. The changes were visible not only in Japan's cities, but in its spirit. The nation that had once worshipped the sword was now worshipping the pen, the plow, and the textbook. Factories produced not weapons, but tools, radios, and sewing machines. Women, newly enfranchised, took seats in local assemblies. Children grew up hearing the word peace more often than victory. The world had never seen a transformation so swift, so total. Even Winston Churchill later remarked, "The miracle of Japan was not its economic rise. It was its moral rebirth." MacArthur's vision at GHQ in Tokyo. General MacArthur watched this transformation unfold from his office in the Daiichi building, across from the Imperial Palace. He rarely left his post, but on certain mornings he would stand by the window, looking down at the people walking to work. Calm, orderly, alive. He once told an aide, "This is the first time in my life I have commanded an army of peace." MacArthur believed Japan's recovery was proof that occupation could be done through compassion, not coercion. He called it the peaceful revolution, and in many ways he was right. The Japan of 1948 was not the Japan of 1945. It was not merely surviving, it was learning to live again. The final gift in December 1948, a ceremony was held in Yokohama Harbor. The last major shipment of American food aid was being handed over to Japanese authorities. A small crowd gathered: U.S. officers, Japanese officials, villagers, and children. On the dock stood an elderly man, his clothes worn but clean. He stepped forward, bowed deeply, and spoke through an interpreter. "You took our sons in war. You gave our children back in peace. The spirit of Japan will remember this." Even the American soldiers bowed in return. Some wept. It was the last symbolic exchange between victor and vanquished, and it closed the circle of war with dignity. The meaning of victory: by the end of 1948, Japan's recovery was undeniable. The economy stabilized, black markets declined, and public morale soared. But beneath those statistics lay something more profound: the shared understanding that mercy had achieved what war could not. For the Americans, it was the discovery that true power came from rebuilding what they had once destroyed. For the Japanese, it was the realization that surrender had not been an ending, but a beginning. A Japanese poet wrote that year, "Out of ruin grows the cherry tree. From mercy, a new sun rises." And in that single image, a blossom growing from ash, the entire story of Japan's rebirth was captured. The occupation was far from over, but the famine was gone. The hatred had softened, and between two nations once locked in total war, something irreversible had begun: trust. That trust would soon evolve into alliance, economy, and friendship. But first came the aftermath: the slow, deliberate reconstruction of an entire nation's soul. The guns had fallen silent years ago, yet their echo still lingered in every broken street. By 1948, Japan's cities had learned to hum again, not with air raid sirens, but with the rhythm of hammers, trains, and voices speaking of tomorrow. The famine that once stalked the countryside had retreated. Children no longer dug in the earth for roots. Mothers, who once rationed a handful of barley across days, now cooked rice mixed with imported American wheat. Strange at first, but nourishing. A country that had lived for death was now learning how to live for life. The new morning every morning. Tokyo awakened to a strange sound. Construction. Trucks rattled through streets that were once piles of rubble. Men carried timber, steel, and bricks. Women swept dust from new shop fronts. Small stalls reopened in Ginza, selling clothes stitched from recycled U.S. Army blankets. Children ran barefoot through alleys where once tanks had rumbled. The smell of soy sauce, sawdust, and machine oil filled the air. The smell of rebirth. Electric power returned to neighborhoods that had been dark for years. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first tram lines reopened. People watched them glide through rebuilt streets as if they were miracles of motion. And though scars remained, both physical and unseen, the Japanese spirit, long suppressed by war, was beginning to breathe again. The economic pulse in 1949. American financial advisor Joseph Dodge arrived in Tokyo to bring order to the chaos. He was calm, stern, and precise. A man with no taste for sentiment, but a deep understanding of economic resurrection. His mission was simple in theory, brutal in practice. Balance the budget. Stabilize the yen. End inflation. Factories had to produce efficiently or close. Subsidies were cut, prices were allowed to rise, and government debt was slashed. For a time, life grew harder again. But this time, hardship came with direction. The plan worked. Within a year, the Japanese economy found its footing. Banks reopened, businesses trusted the yen again, and slowly, the world began to trade with Japan once more. For the first time since 1941, cargo ships bearing the Red Sun flag sailed not to conquer, but to sell. Textiles, pottery, and small tools left Yokohama's docks, crossing the Pacific not as spoils of war, but as symbols of renewal. The silent revolution of the people, yet Japan's recovery was not only measured in money, it was measured in people, in how they began to see themselves. The new Constitution of 1947 had changed everything. It stripped the military of power and placed sovereignty in the hands of the people. It granted women the right to vote, legalized labor unions, and established freedom of speech. In towns across Japan, for the first time in history, women stood in line to cast their ballots. They arrived wearing modest kimonos, carrying infants on their backs, and voted with trembling hands, not from fear, but from awe. In schools, teachers spoke of rights, liberty, and responsibility, words that had once been forbidden. Children learned about the world beyond Japan's shores, not through propaganda, but through books, maps, and radio broadcasts. A nation built on obedience was quietly learning democracy. MacArthur's quiet pride general Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, rarely expressed emotion in public. But those who served under him noticed something change. Each morning, he looked out from his office window in the Daiichi building across from the Imperial Palace, the same palace that once commanded war across Asia. Now he saw school children walking to class, merchants opening shops, women cycling to markets. He once told his staff, "These people are doing something few in history have done, rebuilding not just their homes, but their souls." He knew the Americans could not claim full credit. The Japanese, disciplined and resilient, had embraced reform with astonishing speed. They were not just following orders. They were reinventing themselves. The Korean War and the unexpected catalyst. Then, in June 1950, another war erupted, this time not in Japan, but on the Korean peninsula. The Korean War became a brutal struggle between North and South, communism and democracy. For Japan, it became something entirely different, an unexpected lifeline. The U.S. military, now fighting in Korea, needed a nearby industrial base, and Japan, geographically close, politically stable, and hungry for work, was the perfect candidate. Factories in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka sprang to life. They produced jeeps, uniforms, tents, engines, and communications equipment. For the first time in years, laborers worked overtime. Wages rose, shops restocked, and suddenly, the economy that had once relied on foreign charity was standing on its own legs. Economists later called it the special procurement boom. But to the workers in the foundries and shipyards, it was simpler than that. It was dignity reborn. From hunger to hope, by 1951, the signs of true recovery were everywhere. Infant mortality had fallen by half since 1945. Malnutrition was rare in cities that once starved. Hospitals that had once run on candles now used electric lights and modern equipment. The school lunch program, first introduced with American wheat, had become a permanent institution, funded by Japan itself. Children who had once lined up for foreign aid now grew up strong enough to provide for others. The exchange of medicine and food had done more than heal bodies. It had changed minds. The American soldier was no longer a figure of fear. He had become a symbol of mercy, and for many Japanese, that realization would define how they saw the world for generations. The Treaty of Peace, the final step, came in 1951 at the San Francisco Peace Conference. Representatives from 48 nations gathered to formally end the state of war with Japan. In that hall, under the flags of former enemies, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida signed the treaty that restored his country's sovereignty. He signed with steady hands, not of arrogance, but of quiet pride. Beside him, the Americans watched in solemn respect. There were no cheers, no parades, no victory speeches, only the sense that something extraordinary had occurred. An enemy had been transformed into a partner. The treaty also laid the foundation for a lasting alliance between the U.S. and Japan, one that would soon become a pillar of peace in the Pacific. The departure, as occupation forces prepared to leave, Japanese civilians came to the docks once again. This time, not to hide, but to say farewell. Children waved small paper flags. Women offered origami cranes and handwritten notes. A few American soldiers, hardened by years of service, found themselves crying as the ships pulled away. On one dock in Yokohama, an elderly woman stepped forward and bowed deeply. Through an interpreter, she said, "When you came, we feared you. When you fed us, we doubted you. When you healed us, we believed you. Now we thank you." It was not a political statement. It was the distilled emotion of millions. A new beginning. By April 1952, the occupation officially ended. The American flag that had flown over the Daiichi building was lowered. In its place, the red sun of Japan rose once more, not as a symbol of empire, but of peace. Across the nation, church bells and temple gongs rang in unison. People stood in the streets, silent, watching the flag ripple in the wind. The war was truly over. Japan was free again, and utterly changed. The real victory historians would later debate strategy, politics, and policy. But the real victory of the occupation lay in something simpler. The food given to a starving child, the medicine shared with an enemy, the hand extended instead of the gun. Those gestures had reshaped an entire nation's destiny. In the ashes of war, Compassion had achieved what conquest never could. From those first days when villagers watched American trucks bring milk and penicillin, to the final day when ships departed Yokohama, every act of kindness had been a stone in the bridge between two worlds. The bridge that turned devastation into democracy. The bridge that made enemies into allies. The bridge that still stands today. From this moment forward, Japan's story would no longer be about surrender, but about resurgence. Yet behind that resurgence lay the unshakable memory of the occupation's mercy, the spark that lit the miracle to come. Part 52, Tokyo. The first sunrise of Japan's restored independence spilled over the ruins that had become neighborhoods, the ashes that had become foundations. For the first time in 7 years, the nation stood on its own feet, scarred, but standing. The occupation had ended, but the relationship it created had only begun. Where conquest once ruled, cooperation now took root. The story that started with food and medicine would now evolve into one of technology, trade and trust, the making of modern Japan, the rebirth of a nation in the years that followed. Japan's transformation stunned the world. The economy that had been shattered by firebombs and famine became one of the fastest growing on Earth. Between 1952 and 1960, Japan's gross national product nearly doubled. Factories multiplied, cities swelled, and the once empty train lines now carried workers in crisp uniforms, their briefcases filled with the blueprints of a new age. At night, the glow of neon signs began to light Tokyo's skyline. They flickered over restaurants serving rice and bread side by side. The old Japan and the new, sharing the same table. The miracle had a foundation built not on domination, but on dignity. Dignity restored by compassion. America's new ally, the United States, recognizing Japan's recovery, moved quickly to formalize their new bond. In 1952, both nations signed the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, allowing American forces to remain in Japan as protectors, not occupiers. What had begun as control now became cooperation. Japan, renouncing war, relied on the American shield for defense, and in return, provided the stability that America needed in Asia during the Cold War. This alliance wasn't forged from fear or force, but from respect born of shared experience. Generals who had once faced each other across battlefields now met across tables, discussing not surrender terms, but trade policies and peacekeeping missions. It was, as one U.S. diplomat wrote, the most improbable friendship in modern history, and the most enduring. The human side of Reconstruction beyond the politics. Everyday life carried quiet testimonies of gratitude. In schools, children recited English phrases with laughter, not suspicion. Teachers used donated American textbooks to teach science and democracy. Hospitals continued using U.S.-provided penicillin and training manuals, and every summer, groups of American volunteers, teachers, doctors, missionaries, returned to Japan, not as soldiers, but as guests. They were invited to tea ceremonies, school graduations, and temple festivals. They found a country eager to connect, to share, to repay kindness with kindness. In many homes, families kept small souvenirs of those years, ration tins, medicine bottles, Red Cross boxes, not as relics of dependence, but as symbols of rebirth. The cultural exchange, the 1950s and 1960s, saw an explosion of cultural exchange between Japan and America. A blending of two once opposing worlds, American jazz-filled smoky bars in Shibuya and Osaka. Baseball became Japan's national pastime. Young men styled their hair like James Dean, while American students in Tokyo learned calligraphy and Zen meditation. Television sets broadcast both American westerns and Japanese dramas. Pop culture became the new diplomacy. And behind the scenes, this cultural curiosity created a bridge stronger than any political treaty. Because when people learn to enjoy each other's music, language, and humor, they stop seeing enemies. They start seeing reflections. The spirit of industry, by the mid-1950s, Japan's industrial heart was roaring again. Companies like Toyota, Sony, and Mitsubishi, once makers of military equipment, now turned their skills to peaceful innovation. From shipyards to radio factories, efficiency became the new national virtue. The discipline forged in war was repurposed for creation. Engineers studied American designs, not to copy, but to improve. Sony's first transistor radio, inspired by U.S. technology but perfected by Japanese craftsmanship, became a global sensation. It was small, precise, and reliable, a metaphor for the new Japan itself. American executives, once skeptical, began to visit Tokyo to learn. In time, they would find themselves competing with, and admiring, the very nation they had once rebuilt. The Olympic symbol nothing captured Japan's rebirth more clearly than the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. For 17 days, the world watched a nation once synonymous with destruction present itself as a beacon of modernity and peace. Bullet trains carried visitors at unprecedented speed. Tokyo's skyline gleamed with glass towers and neon. At the opening ceremony, Emperor Hirohito stood before the world. No longer a god, but a man presiding over a democratic, peaceful Japan. The American delegation received the loudest applause. In that moment, the war's ghosts seemed to fade. The enemy had become an honored guest. A Japanese commentator summarized it simply: the world saw a Japan that rose not through war, but through will. From occupation to partnership, by the 1970s, the U.S.-Japan alliance had become one of the most vital in the world. America provided protection and access to global markets. Japan provided innovation, technology, and economic strength. But beneath the policy and trade lay something deeper: a shared moral understanding. When American natural disasters struck, Japan sent aid. When Japan faced earthquakes or typhoons, U.S. ships arrived first to help. It was the same pattern that had begun in 1945. Only now, it flowed both ways. The circle of mercy had completed itself. The generational memory for those who had lived through the occupation, the memories never faded. Elderly Japanese who had been children in 1945 often spoke of the American trucks. They remembered the taste of powdered milk, the smell of soap, and the sound of laughter from soldiers who once wore the enemy's uniform. To them, peace had a face, not abstract diplomacy, but the memory of hands that fed them. And for many American veterans, returning to Japan decades later, the welcome they received was unlike any other. They were met not with resentment, but with gratitude. One retired medic visiting a rural village in the 1970s was recognized by an old woman. She bowed and said softly, "You saved my brother. He was 8. You gave him medicine. He lived because of you." It was the kind of reunion that history books rarely record, but that defines history's true meaning. The echo across generations. By the late 20th century, the world called Japan's transformation the miracle. But to those who lived it, it wasn't magic. It was mercy. Mercy turned into policy. Policy turned into progress. Progress turned into peace. And through it all, the memory of those first acts of kindness, the medicine, the food, the gentle hand of the enemy remained at the core of Japan's post-war identity. It shaped not only how Japan rebuilt, but how it treated others, sending aid to Southeast Asia, supporting UN peacekeeping missions, offering disaster relief to nations in need. The compassion once given to Japan had become the compassion Japan now gave to the world. The unseen victory. When historians look back, they often measure war in victories and defeats. But the true victory after 1945 was something unseen: the transformation of hatred into understanding. For centuries, empires had believed that strength was measured by power. The story of Japan proved otherwise, that strength could come from humility, and that peace could be born not from dominance, but from empathy. In villages that once hid from American soldiers, people still tell stories of the trucks that brought milk and penicillin. Parents tell their children that kindness can rebuild what war destroys. And somewhere, in a quiet field beneath Japan's spring blossoms, that truth continues to bloom. The occupation had ended long ago, but the light it left behind, the light of compassion, still guides two nations that once swore to destroy each other. It is a reminder that even in the darkest hour of history, mercy is the most powerful weapon of all. There are moments in history when power reshapes the world, and moments when mercy does. In 1945, Japan lay silent under a sky once filled with fire. Its cities were gone, its people starving, its soul uncertain. And yet from that silence rose something no conqueror could have planned: a quiet act of humanity, a loaf of bread, a bottle of penicillin, a gentle hand offering hope to the defeated. Those gestures didn't rebuild Japan overnight. They did something greater. They rebuilt trust, that fragile bridge between human beings that war always tries to burn. What began as occupation became understanding. What began as necessity became friendship. The Americans who stayed behind didn't see themselves as victors. Many saw themselves as caretakers of peace, trying to prevent another century of hatred. And the Japanese who received their aid didn't forget. They carried that memory forward, through the factories, the schools, the cities that would one day lead the world again. History remembers battles by who wins. But the peace that followed World War II in Japan wasn't won by bullets or treaties. It was won by kindness, quiet, unrecorded, and uncelebrated. The kind that changes hearts long before it changes nations. Today, when an American aircraft carrier docks in Yokosuka, or a Japanese satellite launches with U.S. technology on board, it's easy to forget that these two nations once destroyed each other. But every handshake between them carries the echo of that first moment of compassion when an American soldier gave food to a Japanese child who had never seen bread before. That is the real victory of 1945. Not the end of war, but the beginning of empathy. Because when mercy triumphs over vengeance, and when compassion becomes policy, the world becomes not only safer, but more human.